express yourself. You feel something deep inside. You sense something wants to be released. You know you just can't run and hide. It's your spirit and it cries. Free me, I don't wanna be bound. Free me, I don't wanna be bound. Your spirit wants to be free. You can feel it deep inside. This is the freedom that we want. We've all been waiting such a long time.
Well, welcome to PresbyCast. This is not the voice of your friend Resby because, well, he's the victim of a power outage. And as you all know, he barely has internet anyway, and complete lack of electricity pretty much makes his participation out of the question. But we do have a friend, Chris Drew, multiple serial second banana guest, fifth Presbycaster. I guess that's about where he rates. He's joining us from North Dakota. He's an OPC pastor. I may have mentioned that. He's going to fill in for Resby, and we'll see if we need him. You know, those are big shoes to fill, and we'll see. But we want to introduce our very special guest, Carrie Baldwin. That's Kerry, like the county in Ireland, or the butter. It's supposed to be some great butter. I don't know about that, but Carrie Baldwin. It's good to have you with us. Your Twitter handle is @MereLiberty.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, it's good to be here.
And you are you're a Christian libertarian, and you're involved with the website would be libertarianchristians.com. That's the Christian Libertarian Institute.
Correct.
So we thought this was, I'd actually talked to Bob Murphy about coming on, and he said he would, but I thought, why not start with somebody more in our orbit?
Sure.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, how you became a Christian, and how you became a libertarian.
Sure. Well, I was actually born and raised here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and a member of an LCMS church, Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And so I grew up as a Lutheran, was catechized and confirmed in the faith there, and eventually made my way to Reformed theology through R.C. Sproul and Ligonier Ministries, and spent some time in an OPC church. I'm now currently back at an LCMS church, sort of as their resident Calvinist. But at any rate, that's sort of a brief overview of my journey there. How I became a libertarian is basically in 2008 was the first year that I had an opportunity to vote in the primary elections, the presidential primary elections.
Wait, are you that young? Are you that young? Oh,
I
boy. Unbelievable. I don't know anybody that young, I don't think. No.
I could vote. The first time I could vote was in 2000, but for the 2000 election, but the primaries had already occurred. At any rate, so 2008 was the first time that I could vote in the primaries, and I thought, oh wow, there are all these candidates. How do you choose? And so I had this crazy idea that I would go read the Constitution and figure out what the role of the executive branch was. And it didn't take me very long to figure out that the only candidate up there who was talking about the Constitution and the proper role of government was Ron Paul. So like many libertarians, I came to libertarianism through Ron Paul. Yeah, I've been a libertarian ever since then. I've never been a card-carrying member of the party. And lots of libertarians will tell you that there is a difference between the philosophy and the party. So I'm a philosophical small L libertarian.
Well, that a lot of people describe themselves that way. You know, the way I sort of came to this was through some secular libertarians like Michael Malice, Dave Smith, and from
Oh,
those
yes.
guys into the more academic types, I suppose. And I'm not sure what I am. I guess I'm a Machenite more than anything else. And
There you go.
yeah, and as I was reading, Christianity and liberalism, um, I'll be honest, I was as attracted to Machen's political philosophy as to his theology, and he was certainly it certainly had libertarian tendencies. I think he was a Democrat, but the Democrats were more like classical liberals at that time, certainly than they are now.
Yeah.
So you're a Ron Paul small L libertarian.
Correct.
All right. So we have that's probably and I really sort of avoided the whole Ron Paul thing, but I've come to it more. I've come to it later than that.
Yeah.
All right. So I muted Chris because it sounded like he was having a family squabble there. But let's unmute Chris. Chris, just right off the bat, do you have any questions for Carrie before we get into some more general questions, big questions about libertarianism?
Well, no, not yet. I mean, I'm familiar with Carrie on having seen some of her tweets. And I was actually surprised. I'd seen enough of them that I actually assumed I had already followed her. But I just did a few minutes ago. So I am interested to hear what you have to say, Carrie, in particular, whether or not you support jaywalking.
Absolutely favorite.
Good.
Yeah, it's our custom. When we're at General Assembly, we always jaywalk and shout something when we do it. So that's a time.
Well, and I believe that Machen advocated for jaywalkers.
Oh yeah, he wrote letters to the editor about that. He was against jaywalking laws. Thought that was
right,
an inhumane restriction on the freedom of man.
Yes.
All right, so we've established that Chris knows who you are, and because there's a little volume differential between you, I'll have him muted. He can wave his arms or set fire to something. I don't know that he wants to speak.
Okay.
But his job is to be my real co-host. Resby he's the strong silent type, or
Gotcha.
something in silent. I don't know which adjective actually should describe him. So let's talk about some just kind of, because this is sort of going to be a libertarianism and Christian libertarianism for dummies type thing. And so if I met you in an elevator, hopefully with my mask on, and I said, "What is libertarianism? How would you give that to me in 3 minutes?"
Sure. So libertarianism is a political philosophy. It's a view of civil governance that is based on a particular view of what persons are, what property is, inherent rights, and specifically the legitimate use of coercion. And so when we talk about what the proper role of civil governance is, we're talking about their role in adjudicating disputes between human beings. And those human beings all have inherent rights. And those inherent rights, we believe, are best expressed through property rights. And so we would say that we basically have a property right in ourselves. And so we have self-ownership. And then we have a property right in the things we come across that are justly acquired. So if I, buy something, then that is my justly acquired property. If I grow an apple tree and pick the fruit off the apple tree, that is also justly acquired property. So that's basically it in a nutshell.
All right. So, the non-aggression principle is a big part of libertarianism.
Yes.
I mean, when I look at the Bible, the way I see the role of government is to protect, me and my property from you, and your property from me, and then kind of collectively to protect us and our property from other, large groups of people who would want to come in and
Sure.
take it away. And anything beyond that, I think it's sort of what we call in the South gravy. I don't know if you
Yeah,
have I don't know if you have gravy in New Mexico,
we
but
do. Yeah.
okay, good. I'm glad to hear that. Um,
Yeah.
so that's sort of a very minimalistic way of looking at it, but it does have a lot to do with property, and we may talk
Hmm.
about this later. But famously, you debated in New York City at a big venue another libertarian about abortion, and
Yes.
and not all libertarians are pro-abortion or pro-choice, as we'd say,
Hmm.
and the idea of property applies to personhood. And you made the argument, I'm sure, I've read other arguments about this, that the fetus or the zygote or the embryo or whatever, at the moment that it's independent, it's its own, it has a right to itself and to
Yes.
life. So
Yes.
I think it's good to throw out there that not all libertarians are drug addled, uh,
Right.
video game playing, pro-choice maniacs.
Yes, that is true.
That's
And in
only
fact,
that's only most of them. Right.
well, I was going to say I think there's even, the Libertarian Party and sort of the libertarian stereotype is that they're very, very pro abortion. And I have run into more people who consider themselves pro-choice and believe that there should be some restrictions on it, and so they're not, strictly speaking, a free for all on abortion. I've met very few people who actually believe in a free for all on abortion. So we the uh, the abortion debate is not a settled one in libertarian circles.
Right. Uh, now, I heard someone, I don't even remember who it was. I've listened to so many libertarians, and I've read and listened to a good bit of von Mises and Rothbard
Hmm.
recently. Of course, Rothbard was pro-choice,
Hmm.
but I've heard someone say that libertarianism is not a comprehensive worldview. I mean, it's sort
Correct.
of a way of looking at the world and a way of explaining things, but it's not. It doesn't. There's not a libertarian position on absolutely everything.
Correct. Yeah. So, a worldview is something that's all encompassing, right? We have a Christian worldview is going to have a Christian lens through which we observe things from, including politics, but also, what education is and how the sciences work, the natural sciences work, and um, relationships, and so the social order and the historical significance of various events throughout history, right? We all look at that through a Christian lens. Libertarianism doesn't, it won't do that. You can certainly look at history or look at society or look at the sciences through the lens of um, you know property rights and economics and things like that. But when it comes to actually determining what the civil law should be based on, that's very, very narrow.
Uh, Chris, any questions at this point?
Well, I mean, actually, quite a few. I've been typing some things down as you've been speaking,
Sure.
Carrie.
Now, we're talking now more
Things
we're
with,
talking more about general libertarianism than Christian
Yeah.
libertarianism at the moment.
well, you touched on the worldview thing. When you mention certain fundamentals of libertarian political philosophy, which you did when you started
Hmm.
speaking a few minutes ago, you were mentioning things like justly acquiring property and justly recognizing the fruit of
Right.
your literal fruit tree property. Um, so when you talk about that and you think about the general terms you're using there, the questions that start bubbling up on my mind is, what is
Yeah.
just? Who defines that? who grants us our right to ourself. So I appreciate everything you said. I'm going to be curious to see how that ties in with a Christian understanding of who we are as human beings made in the image of God, and along with tie-ins with
Sure.
Romans 13. I'm sure several other things you've been thinking of too. So that's kind of where my mind is right now. And I'm curious to see how that part of the discussion goes. But in terms of general questions of the libertarian political philosophy, I don't really have anything specific. I'll just be curious to see where it goes from there.
Okay. So I guess before we get into the Christian libertarianism, which libertarian thinkers most have influenced you? I mean, is it Rothbard? Is it, it seems to me my limited exposure, von Mises is much more about economics, and maybe shaping government, like as a minarchist, which means a small government, night watchman state.
Right.
But who do you point to first and foremost?
Yeah, so the intellectual heavyweights that I follow are definitely going to be Mises and Rothbard. There are some others who have influenced me, including Gerard Casey, who talked about the the compassionate side of libertarianism and what would be called market anarchism, which is just a completely unregulated market. Some others include Gary Chartier and Roderick Long. And I think J. Gresham Machen also has an influence insofar as how, as a Reformed believer, I should be looking at political issues. It shouldn't be just, holding to one side or the other, taking up loyalties. It's addressing some of those basic fundamental things about who we are as human beings, what God created us to be, and our liberty.
All right. So again, the caricatures of libertarians would be either really geeky, pedantic guys in three-piece suits, maybe with wide rim glasses and probably bad hair. That might be the right libertarian or the economic libertarians. And then you have, what could only be described as libertines. My son, who used to be a Ron Paul fan, I talked to him about libertarianism. He says, you don't want to go there. He says, I've been around those guys. And I think he was talking about, the 25-year-old, anything goes. And that's what I'm here for, sort of libertarian. You are none of the above on that.
No.
Right.
No, not at all.
All right. So let's talk about Christian libertarianism in particular. What is it? I mean, how does Christian libertarianism incorporate the ideas of libertarianism into the view?
Right. So, libertarianism itself is really grounded in various forms of natural law theory. And I say various forms because, when we think about natural law theory, we're thinking of Thomas Aquinas. And although there are Thomists in libertarian theory, I think, Murray Rothbard was a Thomist. But there are also, different non-Thomistic views of natural law. So Mises himself was his sort of claim to fame was the book Human Action and Praxeology, and the idea that we can, by studying human action, which is what praxeology means, that we can actually observe and derive laws about the way the world works, how we interact with one another, and that those turn out to be economic laws, much in the way that, say, the laws of physics would be. So when we talk about what persons are, what property is, what inherent rights are, we're talking about, from a Christian perspective, how God created the world and the order that he created the world with. And we can observe that order, just like you can observe how, how a plant grows by just watching it and seeing what it does. We can also observe human societies and how they interact and look for patterns. And those patterns tell us that there's an actual order there. So from the Christian perspective, what we're doing is we're saying, yeah, there is a natural order to this. God created that natural order. And in fact, we can find in scripture where God talks about that order. And so we find lots of various places in which, scripture talks about property. Scripture talks about, when it says, thou shalt not kill, right? It's assuming that it's not just morally wrong to kill, but it's assuming that that person has a right to live. And that right comes from God, because murder is not just a sin against that person, murder is a sin against God. So at any rate, the idea here is just simply that we see this political philosophy, which expresses views that are very much compatible with Christian theology, and so we point out where that common ground is. And since we're talking about natural law and the idea that the world was created with an order, then we would say that God actually intended it to be this way. God intended for us to, be individuals with rights to property, and that, his ordination of civil governance in, for example, Romans 13 is specifically about adjudicating the disputes that will inevitably arise, in just from human beings interacting with each other in a fallen world.
Well, my view is all over the Bible, early on, from Genesis onward, and into the New Testament, you see a lot about private property and the rights of individuals. And as Calvinists, we don't believe in a certain kind of free will, but
Right.
Freedom to make choices is extolled as a good thing anywhere
Yes.
in the Bible.
Yeah.
And while that there's some people today, it seems like they want persecution, or they want things to get worse because that's supposed to make us all holier. Usually it makes people much worse.
Right.
So even though God will be with us through persecution and terrible things, freedom and liberty, I think, by implication and explicitly in some places, is extolled in the Bible.
Yeah.
God's free. Of course, we know He's the only truly free being, but I think He wants us to be free in many ways, and to be able to act and to willingly, freely glorify Him and serve Him. And let me unmute Chris and see what he's got to say.
Sure.
All right.
I was just going to agree with what you were saying, Chortles, and just wanted to touch on one particular point as it relates to private property. I think there's no question that the Bible presupposes that there is this idea that human beings can have, keep, and acquire and dispose of things which are theirs. The moral law of the Ten Commandments makes that clear, and I think it's rooted throughout the entirety of Scripture. With respect to freedom and human liberty, I think that is an essence of what it means to be a human being. I think in the fall, what we see is that, and this relates to the human will too, is that our wills are tainted with sin in the fall, and our freedom is tainted with sin in the fall. We freely choose and will to do all kinds of things in an unregenerate state. But we understand from Scripture that what we will freely choose and what we will freely do will be inevitably corrupted by human sin. That the gospel frees us from that so that our liberty can be a true godly, holy liberty and a true godly uh, 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 freedom
Yeah.
to live into the fullness of the way we were originally designed to be at the creation.
Yes.
Is that a good way of putting it?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way of putting it. In fact, it's really funny that you guys brought up that libertarian who is a libertine who thinks he can get away with everything, and the reality is that libertarianism does put boundaries up as to where our freedom, to the extent of our free action, and that has to do with the non-aggression principle. We are not permitted to initiate aggression, which is violence or coercion or the threat of those one of those two things. We're not allowed to initiate that against anybody, and we are allowed to use self-defense, but that's proportional. So that's even our self-defense is limited to just simply stopping the aggression. An overreaction or using too much self-defense in response to that is considered itself an initiation of aggression. So libertarianism as a philosophy definitely has boundaries as to where our liberty begins and ends. um, and I think that's definitely in line with what we see in scripture. So one other thing that I wanted to point out is a lot of Christians will accuse Christian libertarians of being utopian in their thinking, and a libertarian society would only work if everybody's all good. And I want to say that we actually take into account sin and the fact that sin exists, and that it's inevitable that we are going to disagree with one another, have conflict with one another, sin against one another. We understand that. And so when we talk about the role of civil governance, we're talking about a particular role that we need as human beings, living in a fallen world. Certainly from a Christian perspective, it's God ordained. But that where civil governance does not have legitimate authority to act, we're free to interact with one another, and even use different means of conflict resolution when we're not talking about a rights violation.
Something I wanted to make clear is that well, this happens on live shows. I've just forgotten exactly what I was going to say. I'm much older than you. I was voting in 1983, not 2008. But the Christian libertarians, I assume you find some of the justification of these things in the law, in the law of God. I mean, you see the property rights there.
Mm-hmm.
You see the rights to life.
Mm-hmm.
But now I've remembered what I was going to say. It is that in that there's freedom. We would extol freedom in society, but we don't say that there's only one type of society. Machen was big on saying that in involuntary organizations, such as the nation, there should be a great emphasis on liberty and tolerance. But a Christian libertarian does not say that a libertarian who chooses to join the church with its own set of doctrine and restrictions is free to violate that. That's a voluntary organization, and a voluntary organization. I mean, in a sense, its property is its right to set its conditions for membership and what what must be a minimum of what must be believed, and to bind its members to a standard of conduct and discipline. So some people I can imagine would think, well, a Christian libertarian thinks they can do and believe whatever they want to, even in the church. But I gather that's not your view.
No, not at all. As we mentioned before, libertarianism is just about the civil aspect. And I certainly, as an individual, and you as an individual, have a right to believe in whatever religion you want, at least as far as the state is concerned, um, or civil governance. But entailed in our ability or our freedom to voluntarily associate with one another, we can also create agreements with one another. We can create contracts with one another with stipulations which say, okay, if you do this, I'll do that. In the context of the church is saying, this is what we believe. If you join us, this is how things will work. This is how, we deal with certain disputes regarding sin and things like that. And I'm joining in agreement with that. And so that's a voluntary relationship. It can also voluntarily end. But we would say that that is a relationship that the civil sphere can't intervene with unless there is an actual rights violation. So if somebody in the church violated somebody's rights, then the civil sphere would
Yeah,
come in.
as with abuse or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, and so the Westminster Confession of Faith says that the church is its power is only ministerial and declarative, and its power is spiritual, not temporal. And that comports with, libertarians are going to like that, to say that the church is not telling the nation or necessarily your neighbors what to do, but has the right to set its own standards and operate properly in its, to use a dirty word, sphere. So, yeah. One of the things I've noted about, and I guess I didn't really know Christian libertarianism existed until a few months ago, but it's not really a doctrinal. The cohesion of the group is not doctrinal. There are all sorts of doctrines and denominations and ideas contained in it. So it's very much parachurch. It's not. There are no libertarian churches.
Right.
There are libertarians in churches, and I think you all come together to sort of compare notes. And there's the website.
Yes, there it is.
You have a lot of stuff on there, or you appear on their podcasts sort of regularly, and you may want to tell us something about this book before we're done. But I just wanted to bring that up on the screen. That is libertarianchristians.com. That was formed by Norman Horn?
Yes, Dr. Norman Horn. That was, I forget which year he started that, but it started out as libertarianchristians.com. And he was basically the only guy who was talking about what he calls the intersection of faith and politics. And eventually it grew, and they became a nonprofit institute. It is ecumenical, so you will find articles on there that are not from a Reformed perspective. I'm sort of their Reformed gal, so I write from a Reformed perspective. And you can easily find my articles on there. We did write this new book, Faith Seeking Freedom, which I'm really, really excited about. It's basically a Q&A of all the tough questions that have been asked of us over the years. And so this is everything from, what's the theological basis for supporting libertarianism? What are the basics of libertarianism? What does it mean to be a self-owner? What are property rights? Why are those important? And then we also talk about all the policy issue questions. So we talk about policy issues concerning the environment and concerning Christian ethics and morals. So we talk about prostitution and drug use and suicide and let's see what else. We talk about war and nationalism. There is the chapter on abortion, which I wrote. We all had about a quarter of the book a piece to write, but they have basically allowed me to take the reins on the abortion topic. So yeah, that's actually being published. It's coming out on November 10th, and you can get a copy of the Kindle version on pre-order right now for 99 cents. Afternoon or on November 10th, it goes up to regular price, which I think is $9.99 for the Kindle and $11.99 for the paperback. I would actually love to give away a copy to one of your listeners. But yeah, that's what's going on with that.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to refer to that before I forgot and got too far ahead. So our live viewers can see that, and we'll refer to it again before we're done. All right, so we've talked about the Libertarian Christian Institute and the fact that you would assert that Christians can be libertarians. Doesn't imply libertinism,
That's correct.
antinomianism, lawless living, that sort of thing. So I guess we should also talk about what kind of libertarian can a Christian be. And I would, again, I'm a novice, but I think the two main kinds of libertarianism when they talk about government is it's minarchy and anarchy.
Yeah.
Minarchy would be the most minimum government possible, sometimes referred to as the night watchman state, meaning minimal government, maximal freedom, but recognizing the need for security and some order. And then there's also anarchy. Now, I know sometimes anarchy only refers to markets, but people who delve into this are going to run into minarchists, anarchists, and the anarchy word, given what we read in Romans 13 and other places, may scare people. But let's talk about minarchy and anarchy and how that relates to Christian libertarianism.
Sure. So this is actually it should be more simple than it sounds. First of all, the anarchy is the colloquial use of the word anarchy is typically means chaos and lawlessness, but the etymology of the word anarchy simply means without rulers. So libertarian anarchists are people who believe that we can have law and order without a monopoly on civil governance. So minarchists believe that there needs to be, a single entity that, called the state, who's in charge of minimal services. So adjudication of disputes, creating a known and agreed upon law, and then law enforcement. And that's essentially the minarchist view. And then the anarchist view is simply that the state is distinct from civil governance, which is a service. And so libertarian anarchists believe that adjudication of disputes, law enforcement, and creating a known and agreed upon law is actually better created through what is known as stateless civil governance or a polycentric legal order.
Now, a lot of people would ask, I think small government is the role of a lot of people. So that's a libertarian principle applied to our existing system. Some people would want to blow up the existing system and make it minimal. But an anarchist system, even as you describe, is so far from what we have. I believe a lot of people would look at that as sort of pie in the sky or just theoretical or just an ideal, maybe even to be worked for. But maybe some people would say anarchists can safely talk about it because they know they're never going to get there. What would you say? What would you say about to that?
Well, I had somebody on my podcast. Actually, it was Gary Chartier. I talked about him in the beginning, and he wrote a book on anarchy and legal order. And he's writing from a natural law theory perspective. And one of the things that he points out is that we already have in existence third party, I forget how he calls it, third party dispute resolution agencies. And we see this actually if you ever sign a contract. Many times there's a section in the contract that says if there's a dispute about this contract, you agree to third-party arbitration. And so we actually already have in existence today organizations that do this sort of arbitration. And so it's not terribly pie in the sky. We also have there are cities that have privatized law enforcement, which I know has been sort of a it's been a hot button issue with the BLM and what they mean by defunding the police and that sort of thing. The libertarian anarchist view definitely believes that there should be law and order. It's possible to adjudicate disputes and create, that generally noted and agreed upon law, and we can actually have a private law enforcement such that you have competing agencies, which has the effect of any other service provided for by the market. Problems related to police brutality and police officers getting away with, in some cases, literal murder wouldn't happen if they had the liability concerns that a private institution has. So we would actually say that we have these structures in place already. And so it is very possible for us to have an anarchist sort of society, the stateless civil governance. It is definitely it definitely produces some cognitive dissonance in those who believe that that the only way that we can have those things is through a minarchist or a limited government sort of situation. And I would say that the relationship between libertarian minarchists and anarchists are very friendly. We both agree on the same basic principles. We dialogue back and forth with one another about what that means. And so you don't have a lot of the animosity that sometimes comes in politics, but it is an ongoing discussion. And I think even libertarian anarchists would prefer to see, Christians and even non-Christians become libertarian first, and we can have the anarchist conversation, when it comes up.
So naturally, now it's a good time to talk about Christian libertarianism and Romans 13. I know on the Libertarian Christians website, there's an article about that. I meant to read it. I never got around to it. I did read some views of Romans 13 from various libertarians. But how would you address Romans 13, which says, it presupposes authorities, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resist what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. And then verse 3, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. So how do Christian libertarians address that?
So, yeah, we would say that Romans 13 specifies that God ordains the administration of civil justice. And this involves the legitimate use of coercion or coercive retribution against aggression. So that would be, your law enforcement or even a personal use of self-defense against somebody. Aggression against, or excuse me, it involves the legitimate use of coercive retribution and the enforcing of restitution from adjudicating disputes. And we would say that it sees civil governance being strictly limited by God to the narrow scope of civil justice. Now, when it talks about not being a terror to good, it's The difficulty comes up when we see that the state apparatus, members of the state, whether it be law enforcement or lawmakers, are actually being a terror to good. They are actually creating policy that is against the moral will of God. And so, one of the things that we point to is that what we're obligated to in these scripture verses is the lawful use of that authority, and that things like tyranny are not a lawful use. And there's one scripture verse that I don't think is commonly brought up when it's talking about the state, but I think it's valid, is 1 Corinthians 8, verses 5-6, where Paul says, "For although there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods, many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist." And so, among other things, this is to say that many so-called lords or rulers have no more genuine civil authority from God than so-called gods have genuine deity or divinity. So there are people who claim an authority, which, they do not have a legitimate authority. So we make a distinction between legitimate authority and illegitimate authority. And simply making the claim to that authority doesn't mean that that authority has actually been given. So the authority given is based on, what we do see in the law as far as, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, that sort of thing, where, where we can see that plainly. The problem arises when we start seeing the state actually initiating that kind of violence on people, and stealing through taxation. If libertarians are famous for calling taxation theft, and even you know enacting policies which have detrimental effects on human beings. We can't say that's actually a good or in line with God's moral will. So we draw that distinction when it comes to Romans 13. And so we would say that Romans 13 is talking about legitimate civil governance and not merely a claim to it.
Yeah, I don't think Romans 13, there's the positive, undeniable assertion that God's sovereign and that he's instituted and he's sovereign over these governments. But when he says, when it says that terror rulers are not a terror to the good, but only to the evil, I think that's talking about what ought to be,
Mhm.
but obviously is not asserting that that is always the case,
Right.
and the government's always right. So we've definitely run into this conundrum in
Mhm.
2020, and
Yes.
I wonder if 2020 hasn't made. I'm sure it's made some state worshipers and some sheep, but I think it's made a few libertarians too.
I hope so.
So let's talk about Romans 13, uh, the civil edicts that have been handed down, not just for churches but for businesses,
Mhm.
individuals. What about the collision of 2020 and Christian libertarians?
Oh man, such a can of worms. There's so much going on there. Um, when it comes to the law of the land, right? The law of the land in the United States is supposed to be the Constitution. And one of the problems that I have seen in particular in my own state, in particularly, but it's more or less bad elsewhere, is acting outside of constitutional authority, in by way of these edicts. We call them executive orders. And it's odd to me that something as elementary to civics, as which we have three branches of government. Which branch of government is the lawmaking branch? And people don't seem to realize that there's only one lawmaking branch, which is the legislative branch. And yet we have we have governors who are making these executive orders and treating them as though they are law. And of course, that is made even more problematic because a lot of these executive orders were sort of baptized, if you will, by previous forms of legislation that sort of gave governors, blanket authority in case there was ever a big, scary pandemic. And so the question that comes up, or that should come up, is whether the uh, whether it is a legitimate use of civil governance to actually control everything that may happen during an emergency. Because in many cases, what the state does is it expands its authority when an emergency arises. And so they exploit that emergency rather than trying to, actually take care of the situation. There's one writer who is, he's a Christian. I'm sure he's not Reformed, but his name is Robert Higgs, and he wrote a book called Crisis in Leviathan, which is an excellent book. And so he talks about this pattern. He studied this pattern of history where government's greatest growth happens in a crisis, and they always use the excuse of, we're going to keep you safe, we need to get this thing under control. And so people who are seeking security will give up their rights thinking we're going to get them back later, and they never do. The government never returns that power. So that creates a problem, because then we're asking, okay, did the legislators have the authority to give the executive office this sort of blanket power in case of an emergency? That's a question that should be asked. Does the governor really have the authority to require masks or forcibly shut down businesses? Are these actual, is this an actual role of government, proper role of government, or is this an overreach? And of course, the other side of that is the question of, well, how do we deal with a pandemic, right? And certainly in the beginning, there were, I think, more people who were much more cautious about COVID-19 and just how dangerous it could be. And so there was much more willingness, I think, to kind of comply and cooperate and go through with it, believing that, in 14 days, life would return to normal because we would have, quote unquote, flattened the curve. And we are now, I don't even know how many, we're several months away from 15 days. So, these questions come up about, does the government have this authority? Is this a legitimate use of power? In my state right now, one of the things that the governor is doing is telling restaurant owners, your employees have to subject themselves to random COVID testing, and if they don't, we're going to shut you down. And that's a literal invasion of your body. It's the government practicing medicine, which if anybody else practiced medicine without a license, they would be, in big trouble for it legally. So, this whole mess with COVID-19 should cause us to question, what is the legitimate role of government? Did America create the best healthcare system in America because the government managed it, or because those people with those skills were free to flourish and explore and be scientific and go through the scientific process and innovate? And so, that's sort of where we're at, I think.
So, what Christians have performed well in the pandemic, do you think? I really think most Reformed Christians have bent over backwards to comply with the government, almost to, to maddening degrees, to some people. I mean, you try to balance Romans 13 and love of neighbor and freedom. That's at least, three things in conflict at some level. But who's handled it well, if anybody?
That's such a hard question because you have with politics, and this is one reason why I began writing my work. Politics is polarizing, and what it does is it takes people who normally get along with one another and don't mind their disagreements with one another, and it causes them to pull away and to treat one another as though they are the enemy. And I've seen some reformed Christians who have taken the route that we need to, you know, we need to ignite a second, an American Revolution 2.0. And then you have the reformed Christians who are saying, no, the government is doing this for our best interest. We should comply with that. I think the I think that there's a third group, which are those Christians who are simply not complying with it. They're going about it knowing that they are free to choose before God. They're free to choose whether it's appropriate to wear a mask or not, whether it's appropriate to socially distance or not, whether it's appropriate and necessary to attend church and sing or not. Um, and so, I think that one of the most disappointing things that I've seen in this is that polarization, even among believers, and this idea that we have to, pull away and ruin our fellowship and our unity with one another simply because we have some disagreements. Like the whole point of us being human beings with a mind and an ability to reason and our own skills and talents and perspectives is that we bring something unique to the table, and we need each other and we need our unique perspectives. And right now that's sort of pulling away and polarizing. And so I wouldn't say that there's necessarily a group who's doing the best, although, in my opinion, voluntary noncompliance is probably the best. But there's no reason to demonize one side or the other. I think that of my friends who prefer complying with the masks and all of these regulations, they're people who feel like they have a genuine vulnerability and they have genuine health concerns. Or I know somebody who's experiencing quote long COVID, and she's trying to talk about those effects. And I think that those are all necessary things to discuss. This is why we need our medical system. This is why we need our medical system to be released from the grasp of bureaucratic top down guys like Fauci or whatnot who are saying, we need this blanket rule for how we're going to deal with it. That's not how medicine works. That's not how science works. We need to free our scientists to be able to work with these problems, and they're legitimate problems. And I think that we should acknowledge that and not just simply chalk up those people with the greater fears or the greater vulnerabilities as simply being sheep or whatever. On the other hand, their tendency to demand of those who see the rules as coming down from the state and problematic because it's come down from the state, aren't appreciating the fact that tyrants grow out of this out of crises. And I mean, I hate to bring it up, but and compare this to Nazi Germany, but Nazi Germany, the problem with Nazi Germany started because of a health crisis. It was just associated with Jews. And the fear of viral infection is a very base fear of humanity, because viruses and pathogens have always been, the one thing that could easily wipe out a third of our population. So, there is that element of legitimate crisis, but there is this element of people taking advantage of crisis and expanding their power and taking advantage of other people in a crisis. And there's very little, I think there's very little discussion, or even potential for discussion between those two groups to work out the nuances, because there are necessary nuances. You know, we don't want to give the state total control over our lives, because they'll take it and they'll never give it back. And history shows us that that kills way many people than what a virus will do.
So let's talk about love of neighbor.
Yes.
Some people would say libertarians are selfish and they only care about their own bank account and their freedom to do what they want to do. But it seems to me that preserving freedom for other people is a way to love your neighbor. Machen was very pro-family to the extent that he didn't want families to be told what to do in education or work on a farm or in a family business. He was pro-immigrant. He thought immigrants should be able to keep their language, and that children should be able to learn or retain foreign languages or become bilingual, not to become Americanized by force.
Yeah.
So let's answer those who would say that libertarians are selfish, and by definition, they don't love their neighbor. I mean, is there a value to freedom in and of itself? Is liberty a virtue?
Yeah.
Is liberty love of neighbor?
So this is an interesting thing. I'm reading a book from Dietrich von Hildebrand about this book has to do with marital love, but the first thing that he goes over is what love actually is. And so he talks about what love is not and what love is. And the point that he comes to is that love is finding value in another person as a person. So it's the whole, it's the whole individual. And love is not something that seeks out any sort of utility from people. They are not means to an end. And so, if you're treating somebody as simply a tool to your own satisfaction, that's not love. And in libertarianism, we talk about self-interest, which that term can often be confused with selfishness. But self-interest is just basically the idea that, we're human beings with a life. We have an interest in preserving that life. And certainly that is the case with these two groups that we've talked about with COVID. They're both interested in preserving their life, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we can't use people as a means to an end. And libertarianism is absolutely adamantly opposed to using people as a means to an end. Of course, the other part of that is that finding value in another human, another person as a person, is going to be subjective. I can't actually find that value in another person that I've never met. I mean, I can respect them as a human being insofar as they have rights, they have agency, and that's a very basic way of looking at it. And there are people that I know that I would say I don't love in the sense that they have maybe treated me badly, and I don't, so I don't open myself up to a relationship with that person. But I still don't use that person as a means to an end. Often what I hear is, from people who want to say that libertarianism is selfish because it's self-interested. I like to draw the analogy between that and the utopian dystopian novel of A Brave New World, from Aldous Huxley. And you know, that book can be a very difficult read, because there's some pretty scandalous ideas in there. But the fundamental idea that Aldous Huxley was trying to point out is that a society that has zero self-interest, who lives for the sake of other people, you have you have no love, you have no marriage, you have no family, you have no right to your body. Um, those are all things that are fundamental to the Christian faith. Uh, we we have, Scripture talks about how rape is wrong, right? That is completely immoral. Well, in a society that uh, isn't that has zero self-interest, there's no such thing as rape. So, to what extent do we say that love of neighbor requires somebody to act against their conscience, or to do something, like wearing masks? There are legitimate reasons to not wear masks. Now, maybe the best thing that I can do to love my neighbor who feels they need the mask is to simply stay away from them. But it doesn't obligate me to do something that in my conscience I can't do, or maybe physically can't do. One of the there's a lecture from R.C. Sproul about the tyranny of the weaker brother, and how the weaker brother can sometimes come off as weak, but his the demands that he's making aren't actually from a weak standpoint. And so the weaker brother isn't always the one who's making the demands. And the other part of that too that I want to say is that when we talk, because we mentioned abuse a little bit earlier, one of the elements of of an abusive relationship is this one-sided, you have to do something for me. If you love me, you're going to do this for me. If you love me, you're going to violate your conscience, or do something that's maybe physically harmful to you. That's abusive, and that's not loving your neighbor. The point that we have to realize is that we are human beings living in a fallen world. We are individuals with rights, but we are also living in community, and we are capable of doing that. There is an order that God has created that is embedded in all of reality, and that order exists. And when we try to act against that order, that's when the chaos and lawlessness results. We have an increase in state power and state overreach, and the results of that state power and overreach are riots and looting and violence. That's the chaos and lawlessness. It's not the created order that God made. It's when we act against that created order that we get chaos and lawlessness. And so we can love our neighbor in the best way that we can. And maybe that means wearing a mask. Maybe that means staying away for a time. But these are all individual choices, and we have to take into account the nuances of each person, the individual that we are, and then the individuals that we come in contact with. And that's not something that can be centrally planned. It's impossible to centrally plan that.
Well, we should address two issues before we're done. One concerning welfare versus private charity. Some Christians would say you need to vote this way because this party will support the safety net. They'll help people. They're for abortion, but they'll actually reduce abortions because everybody will be, happy, healthy, and they'll have all they need, and because they're so well taken care of, they won't make terrible choices, and there won't be any unwanted children, and abortion will go down. And then the other, so you have to vote for the party of the welfare state. But others would say, I assume the libertarians would say that for centuries, in before the era of big centralized government, the church and private organizations and individuals banding together and communities at a small local level provided welfare and, in effect, that safety net. They did it willingly and for moral reasons and not under compulsion.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, can we love our neighbor by taking the government out of the welfare business?
Oh, yes, most definitely. When I when I put out my first episode on abortion, it was a constructive criticism of the pro-life movement. And one of the things that I was critical of was this lack of knowledge about the economic aspect of abortion. Um, and to one extent, the liberal side of this is correct because women do, or the majority of women who seek abortions do so because of two reasons: either poverty or bad relationships, or both. And so it's very easy to make the argument, well, if we just provide welfare programs, right, that takes care of the poverty aspect. And the problem with that argument, that I have is, number one, um, we're taking a correlation between welfare, which is funded by, it's not a strictly capitalist system, but there is capitalist elements to it. Um, a welfare state that is well funded, um, and we're drawing that correlation to the decrease in abortion. But if we understand praxeology and human action and incentive, what we would actually say is that women who um, feel that their most basic needs are met are less likely to abort. And so then we have to ask the question, well, what's the best way to get rid of poverty? And these welfare programs were instituted as a war on poverty, but the war on poverty has created more poverty. And what we actually find, and there was a report that came out last year, right before all this COVID stuff hit, showing how the Western world uh, had lifted the entire world out of abject poverty. So, when somebody tells me, well, we need to love our neighbor by giving them welfare, I can tell you as a single mom, I've been on welfare and I would trade welfare uh, tomorrow for a free market because I would be able to get myself out of poverty much more quickly. I don't want the handout. The handout makes it more difficult. And um, there's a book, um, and gosh, I'm forgetting the author, but the title is called When Helping Hurts. And this is the idea that there are things that maybe we do with good intentions that actually enable or make that problem worse. And I think that's certainly the case with welfare. One thing that I want to point out about, say, healthcare, for example, because one of the things that certainly a woman who's pregnant needs is she needs healthcare. She needs a doctor to make sure that baby is healthy. Well, we this the problem with healthcare being too expensive in America actually started way back in the industrial era, when doctors would be hired by businesses, um, to provide a service to the employees. And so this was called lodge practice. And so the employees would pay an annual fee and they got to see a doctor. They and their family got to see a doctor as many times as they wanted over the course of that year. And those doctors went to the government and they said, hey, we're not making enough money. We don't like that the consumer is setting our wages, because that's what happens in a free market. A free market is the consumer regulates, the consumer sets wages. And so doctors went to the state, and the state said, okay, we'll create insurance agencies and we'll create a licensure process. And in that licensure process, they said, if you want a license, if you want to be a licensed medical doctor, if you want this job, um, you can't participate in lodge practice. And eventually, the hospitals that were run by churches, which gave away their services to the poor as part of their Christian mandate to help the poor, they were eventually taken over by corporations, and those corporations are have a de facto monopoly by way of federal bureaucracy. So all of this intervention by the state in the free market in healthcare has hurt the very people that that we say it's going to help. We say that the Affordable Health Care Act is going to help the poor. It's hurt the poor. Government intervention in the market has hurt the poor. Whereas if we have the free market, we see how that actually lifts the world out of poverty. So if we want to help mothers who are faced with an unplanned, unwanted pregnancy, the best thing that we can give them is options from the free market, is innovation, is competing with abortion agencies. Their crisis pregnancy centers in America actually outnumber the number of abortion clinics out there. The abortion rates ever since the 1980s have gone down. They're now below pre-Roe v. Wade levels. And that's a steady decline. So it has nothing to do with Republican or Democratic policies. It has to do with women feeling like their most basic needs are met. And
the freedom of these agencies to do their thing.
Yes.
So there's a value to freedom.
Yes, there's a huge
of speech and of practice of religion.
Yes. And, Planned Parenthood has wanted to shut down these CDCs these CPCs left and right. They try and make them, talk about abortion. They try and make them refer out for abortion. They try and clamp down on abortion, on these life-affirming alternatives, which CPCs actually offer way more services in many cases than an abortion clinic does. I've seen CPCs offer pro bono law services to women in abusive relationships. Planned Parenthood doesn't do that. They actually facilitate sex trafficking and sex abuse by covering up the fact that they're doing abortions on minors who, are caught up in sex trafficking. So, what is loving your neighbor? I cannot imagine being a single mother myself and not having the innovations of the free market. I'm able to do so many things because of these innovations. I'm able to homeschool my kids while I work from home because the personal computer was invented and is now dirt cheap to get. It's those innovations, those things that make our lives easier, which actually helps women in these situations, which we're never going to get rid of unplanned pregnancies. We're never going to get rid of unwanted pregnancies. There's always going to be women who made poor choices or, tried their best to prevent conception or got wrapped up in an abusive relationship. Like those things are always going to exist. And so what we want to do is be able to provide the most options available to them. And we can do that with the free market. And at least even pro-choice libertarians would stay out of regulating, any of that. They would allow the market to act. And if the free market can lift the entire world out of poverty, then certainly it can help women who are poor and need life-affirming options when they're faced with an unplanned pregnancy.
Well, this is an issue that's important to Chris, so I'm sure he's got something to say here.
Yes.
I mean, a pro-life movie which is available on Amazon, was filmed in his house. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
Yeah, and I'll it is on Amazon Prime. It just has a very simple name. It's called Wheelchair, and a young man who we're hoping will be a deacon in our church wrote it and did a Kickstarter campaign to fund it. And it's very short but very powerful. And so I would commend it to any Presbycast viewer, listener. Wheelchair, available at Amazon Prime and a few other places, which at the moment I can't really think of. But it is available, and I would encourage you to see it. One thing I was going to say about government intervention into some of these things, Carrie, is you see the same thing also in government intervention and regulations regarding adoption in many places too. And what you see in some jurisdictions as a result of things like Obergefell is Catholic Charities and other organizations that were instrumental in placing so many children with parents who were eager to have them, unable to operate anymore out of conviction because of interventions of the state. So you see the same thing, same phenomenon also in adoption.
Anything else, Chris, as we can see the finish line from here? No.
Yeah, I one of the things bantering around in my mind, we've talked a lot about love of neighbor, which is, I think, great. But it's the commandment that's like the greatest commandment. One of the things that's interesting as we've had this discussion is I keep thinking of the quote unquote first tablet of the law. I've been amazed and astonished. Chortles referred to this earlier, to the degree to which churches have bent over backwards to try to accommodate what at the time seemed to be reasonable restrictions on public gathering because of uncertainty regarding the seriousness and magnitude of the coronavirus. What's striking to me, though, is I was listening to the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Synod, General Synod just had its meeting, and a minister there gave an address really exhorting and in very strong terms churches that have not been gathering still because of this government mandates related to public protection. And what I think is interesting is that this has been picked up by churches of all stripes. And I think in particularly the case like in mega churches, like the church that I serve in Grand Forks, our landlord is a mega church that actually owns the mall that we meet in. And what's interesting to me is there's this great willingness, it seems, among many church leaders to not meet in the interest of loving our neighbors at the expense, what it's seeming to be increasingly the expense of the commandments we have to worship God. And I think that's a huge challenge for the church. And I was really appreciative of the man. His name, I asked Ben Glazer about it. He's in the chat tonight. Leslie Holmes gave that address for the ARP, and I would commend it to you if you could find it. It's very interesting. But what's so interesting is it seems to follow along with much of what else the other things we would see sometimes in Big Eva, this need to be seen as doing the right thing, and sacrificing in the process our higher obligation to our maker, our creator, our redeemer. And so it's one of those things that's it's interesting to think about in terms of libertarian philosophy and the desire for humans to be able to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience, and how that seems to have been really trampled on very willingly, even by people in the church who I think should know better. So that's me editorializing more than anything else.
Well,
but
I think
thoughts on it.
I have been blessed to be a part of a church who, we did choose to not meet in those initial weeks, but then we eventually came back. And I have been blessed to be a part of a church who, sees the value of Christian fellowship and worship and word and sacrament. And, you know, one of the things that sort of breaks my heart about those people who are choosing not to meet in the name of loving their neighbor, or, um, mandating uh, people who feel like they can't wear masks, mandating those people to wear those masks to church, and even denying them word and sacrament if they don't wear the masks, if they don't socially distance. And my question for them is, do you really think that God's commands for fellowship and worship are without regard for love of neighbor? I don't see how that can possibly be true. If if the first greatest commandment is to love God with all of our heart, soul, and strength, and the second greatest commandment is to love our neighbor as ourselves, there is no reason in the world why God's commands would be a self-contradiction. So from a purely theological perspective, we should, as Christians, be lovingly calling our brothers and sisters in Christ to question on how it is that they are making church secondary to the state and its demands and edicts. Certainly, from a libertarian perspective, right? The libertarian perspective considers the fact that life is dynamic, it's complex. We have, things about the world that are dangerous, but we also have things about the world that are wonderful and help us to flourish and improve ourselves and just improve our basic quality of life. And recognizing that the free practice of religion for individuals has a positive effect on people, um, even a positive health effect on people. Like, there's no reason in the world why we should be reducing the problem of COVID-19 down to whether we're sneezing or not, whether we've taken a test or not, whether it's been positive or not, whether it's a false positive, or like, that's not science, that's not medicine, that's not caring for people. And at least the libertarian perspective appreciates the complexity and dynamics of human individuals and individuals living in community, and the fact that there are people who are skilled in medicine and healthcare that we need, and we need them to be free to work. But they also need the benefit of our being able to go to our job, which purchases health insurance, which pays the doctors so that they can do their work. We're all interconnected. You can't escape that interconnection. We aren't individuals living on a private island. We are connected, and the libertarian perspective sees that, and they see that it's part of the natural order.
Yeah, and recent events tell us that a private island, nothing good ever happens on a private island these days. Sorry to say that when you were taking a drink.
Oh, I love the reference, though. That was great.
Yeah, well, it's 2020 after all.
Yep.
I would just exhort everyone to think about freedom and liberty, and that. And someone mentioned in the comments, when I hear all this, I think, I'm not my own. I was bought with a price. Well, we're talking about the freedom for people to live that,
Yeah.
to worship the God who bought them at a great price, and to love their neighbors as they see fit, which could be better than the government or the NGO has determined.
Well, and one thing that I want to say is to talk about the Christian perspective of self-ownership, because of course there is that Bible verse that we are not our own. Self-ownership is a concept that, in relation to you and I own myself, you own yourself. I don't have a claim to your body. You don't have a claim to my body. We know this because if I were to, if I were to take your life, that would be murder. If I were to take your property, that would be theft. These are things that violate God's law. Now, in relation to God, we're self stewards, right? So God has given us life. God has given us rights. God has given us all of these things, and we're to take care of it. We're to take care of the earth and cultivate it. We're to be creative and productive. Um, and that is a stewardship that he gives us. So even though ultimately we belong to God, we are not owned in the sense that God is our ultimate owner and owns us. In his ownership of us, he has given us a stewardship, and he expects us to act out that stewardship and be responsible with ourselves, and also respect the stewardship that he's given to other people. And so in relation to each other, it's self-ownership. In relation to God, it's self-stewardship.
All right. Well, we've certainly given people plenty to think about, and anyone that hasn't thought about liberty issues in 2020, well, I don't understand them. Besides libertarianchristians.com, CLI, the Christian Libertarian Institute, where would you direct people who want to know more about this? I mean, again, there are podcasts by Tom Woods, who I think is maybe a Christian of some sort. Bob Murphy, who I'm told is a PCA church member, but I haven't confirmed that. And again, on a secular level, not for everyone. Dave Smith, Michael Malice, who I think have done incredible work during the pandemic and have been very encouraging. Classic works by von Mises, Murray Rothbard. Some people, say, well, Ayn Rand is who you want to go to, but I don't know that anyone claims her fully, and that may be sort of a caricature. So, where would you point people?
Yeah, well, and I would point out that Ayn Rand, she didn't like libertarians, and she said, "No, I'm not a libertarian." But yeah, all of those names are great. There's another Presbyterian guy named Lawrence Reed. He is the president emeritus at the Foundation for Economic Education. He's a wonderful guy. He's written a lot about things that are related to libertarianism and Christianity.
There's a great Machen article on the FEE website.
Yeah. I've met Larry Reed, and he's a fabulous guy and has wonderful stories and just a really great perspective. Let's see who else. Sean Rittenauer is a Reformed believer and an economist at the Mises Institute. Timothy Terrell is an economist. I believe he's connected to the Mises Institute, but I'm not entirely sure how. Oh gosh, who else? You can go to my website, mereliberty.com, and see a lot of discussions of libertarianism from a Reformed perspective. And I can certainly get a list up there of other figures to take a look at. But there's a lot. And I do want to say one thing about Mises. Mises, when he started writing, wrote against Christianity because his experience was with Nazi Germany, and Hitler had claimed to be Christian, and you had the problem of the Lutheran Church in Germany sort of siding with the Nazi state, and so Mises had a very distorted view of Christians when he was living there in Austria. But when he came to America and got exposed to proper Christianity, here he himself is said to have become a Christian. And so he's got some wonderful works. His book, Human Action, actually speaks against abortion. I think it's a very good read. If you want to read some of those heavier things like Murray Rothbard and Mises, there's a podcast called the Human Action Podcast, which has gone through a lot of those heavier books to give some basic summaries so that you're not, drowning in a super intellectual book, but they're all very good. Murray Rothbard, he was pro-choice. He was married to a Presbyterian. And incidentally, Ayn Rand had tried to persuade Murray Rothbard to divorce his Presbyterian wife because she was Christian, and he told her to go pound sand. So at any rate, he's got a book called For a New Liberty, which is a great introduction to a lot of these concepts. I use this book in a critical thinking course that I do online.
Yeah, and it's on Audible at a pretty affordable price.
Well, you can actually get it free from the Mises Institute too.
Yeah, the text is you can get you can download it. Absolutely.
So, but yes, tons of resources. I have resources. The Libertarian Christian Institute has resources. And certainly anybody who has questions can reach out to me in email. My email is Kerry, Kerry @mereliberty.com. You can find me on social media. Follow me. I'm more than happy to field questions. I really enjoy, talking about it and interacting with people on it. So.
Well, you haven't met our listeners, so that could change. She says that now, Chris. Yeah. She doesn't know us very well, does she? Well, it's been good having you on, and I'm glad as I've I think it's obvious to most people. Presbyterian, my co-host, his instincts are definitely libertarian. He's a Grateful Dead fan. But mine are growing in that direction. And we didn't really mention this, but just the chaotic and insane nature of politics today might suggest that people look for an alternative. Now, they may not find that in the Libertarian Party candidate, but certainly libertarian thinking can inform both our view of liberty in the world and in politics, obviously. Although I don't think libertarians have never been good at electoral politics, but they can certainly inform our thinking.
Yeah.
So let me just I've had to keep Chris muted because of the differential in volume. But Chris, any parting words or questions before we wrap up?
No, I really appreciated the chance to meet and speak with you, Kerry. I am the guy in the chat here who was talking about 1 Corinthians and we're bought with a price. So it was just sitting out there in my brain, and I was really appreciative of your response to that. So thank you very much.
Oh, good.
Pleasure for me to be a part of this tonight.
Well, thank you again, Kerry. I think we'll link to your website, and from there, I'm sure they can find many other resources, and it's just something else for us to think about. But I think again, in 2020, liberty and freedom are not selling at a good price, and I think we ought to consider the value of those things, and even the Christian value of them. So we'll look forward to having Resby back soon when his power is restored. Hope the free market can get Resby's power back on. Though I think over in North Carolina, it's sort of all public. And we hope for good things for you in New Mexico. And again, thanks again. And hope maybe we'll do this again. And we hope everyone will exercise their freedom to read Machen and not be an Erdman, and stay Presby if they so choose. So thanks again, and good night to all.
Bring me Jesus will set your spirit free. If you ask him to do it now, all you have to do is ask. You don't have to understand how, and you will be free.
Magic on the internet worldwide.